The Seminole burning case stands as one of the most sensational incidents ever to shake Indian Territory. Almost an entire page in the June 18, 1899 edition of the New York Herald covered the crime that set off the burnings, along with the subsequent trial overseen by Judge R. Thomas regarding the mob's actions. The story included depictions of the courtroom, along with images of Judge Thomas, key figures in the case, and the Muskogee jail. The report stated, "Men who took justice into their own hands, torching two young Seminoles suspected of a heinous crime, would now face the consequences." The conviction of the leaders of this Oklahoma mob has caused a stir throughout Indian Territory. The convictions in this case, involving several members of the mob who burned two accused Seminoles in January 1898, dealt a serious blow to lynch law across Indian Territory and Oklahoma. 52 indictments were issued against mob members, and of the 5 trials completed, only 1 accused escaped conviction. Though the high rate of guilty verdicts may not hold as more cases go to trial, especially with evidence in the ongoing cases appearing less direct than in the first few trials. The crime that led Lincoln McGeisy and Palmer Sampson, 2 young Seminole men, to be burned at the stake was indeed a vile one, but whether they truly committed it may never be known. Supposed confessions were presented as evidence, though they were likely wrung from the men through relentless and brutal torture. Time after time, they were hoisted up, life nearly choked out of them each time before being let down again. Their final moments were nothing short of horrific. In a twisted form of justice, as the brush was piled around them, a man, a preacher no less, knelt beside the condemned men and prayed. When he rose, it was he, according to trial evidence, who set the flames. The Seminole men met their end with a stoic calm. One of them, when the pain grew too fierce, leaned forward to inhale the flames and quicken his death. But the other, as if calling on the spirit of his ancestors who had braved far grimmer tortures in silence, stood tall until the fire took him. A punishment this cruel would be dreadful enough if they were guilty, but the haunting thought remains: they might have been innocent. On the ranch of Thomas McGeisy, a respected member of the Seminole tribe, there was a young white farmer called Julius Leard. On December 30th, 1897, with Leard away, his wife was brutally attacked by 2 young Indian men. The only ones who saw it all happen were the Leard children, who watched their mother's life taken. When enraged locals rounded up every Indian youth they could find, the children couldn't name a single one as the killer. But right before word of the murder broke, a hot-blooded mob from Oklahoma, led by Nelson Jones and a man known as Tex, or Texas Ranger, Sam Pryor, spread out across the land. They caught hold of Lincoln McGeisy first. Even though Leard's child wasn't the man responsible, Jones shackled him all the same, keeping him locked up with John Washington and George Harjo, 2 other Seminoles. They held the men from Sunday straight through to Friday night, January 7, 1898, when Pryor and his group brought in Palmer Sampson. Through that long, brutal week, McGeisy and Washington had been strung up and tormented by the mob, forced to suffer in hopes they'd confess to some part in Mrs. Leard's murder. Yet though they faced unspeakable torture, both men swore they had no knowledge of the crime or who was behind it. Sampson, too, was taken to a remote spot, strung up, and tortured nearly to his last breath. Whether Sampson ever truly confessed will likely remain a mystery. His captors, however, claimed he admitted to killing Mrs. Leard and even named Lincoln McGeisy as an accomplice. Right away, McGeisy and Sampson were heavily chained, following orders from Deputy Marshal Nelson Jones and Pryor. The mob, numbering between 100 and 125, forced the men into a wagon, took them across the Oklahoma line, and chained them to a tree. There, under the mob's bloodthirsty cries, they were set ablaze and left to perish in the flames. The Oklahoma Territory authorities, though denouncing the mob's lawless actions and deeply regretting the unjust conduct of so many folks from Chickasaw country, found themselves stymied at every turn in trying to bring the culprits to justice. Eventually, the matter landed in the hands of the United States courts, which launched a formal investigation. The Department of Justice brought on Horace Speed from Guthrie, Indian Territory, to assist the U.S. District Attorney and his deputies, Wilcox and Parker, in gathering evidence to put before the U.S. grand jury. When the U.S. court convened in Veneta, Indian Territory, come February of 1899, Judge John R. Thomas presided over the proceedings. 52 men faced indictments. When the first case came to trial, the defendants asked for separate trials, which the law allowed them to do. First up was former Deputy Marshal Nelson M. Jones, as his name led the list in the indictment. During Jones's trial, it came to light that he'd suggested torture in the Indians, saying nothing was too harsh for guilty men, should they be caught. He'd made no move to alert the marshal or to curb the mob, but instead took charge, instructing folks to haul the suspects across the line into Oklahoma, out of reach of the Indian Territory courts. With that evidence laid out, Jones was convicted on May 18th. Andrew J. Mathis's conviction followed soon after. Witnesses told how Mathis had knelt to pray with the Indians right after they'd been chained to the stake. Then, right after finishing his prayer, he was seen setting fire to the brush stacked around him. The Seminole burn-in case didn't just stir up a ruckus across the country, it topped the front page of every paper in both Indian and Oklahoma territory. Congress ended up granting each family of the Seminole victims $5,000 or $2,500 to help fund the pursuit of the lynchers. The trials stretched on until all 54 folks indicted had faced the court. Over time, some walked free while others got off with lighter sentences. On September 22, 1899, the trial was moved to Wewoka, marking the first session of the U.S. court ever held in the Seminole Nation. The Purcell Register reported that Judge Thomas's charge was as eloquent and patriotic as any speech the gifted judge had ever delivered, covering the expected ground with a fire of its own. The Commissioner's 1899 report on indemnities showed a total of $13,078.75 granted. Among the awards, $5,000 went to the family of Lincoln McGeisy for his burn-in, along with $1,113.25 for lost property. George Harjo and William Thelico each won $300 for their injuries, while John Washington received $500 for bodily injury and $35 for lost goods. George Colonel got $100 for similar injuries, and another 17 folks received between $25 and $50 each for wrongful arrest and loss of freedom. The Muskogee Times printed a piece on April 21, 1905, shedding light on the aftermath of the Seminole Indian burn-in case. It mentioned how Nelson Jones, the deputy U.S. Marshal who'd been convicted for his part in the lynching, had sent Judge Thomas a cane crafted from leather and decorated with a Masonic emblem.